In a quiet suburban neighborhood where the streets were lined with neatly trimmed hedges and colorful flower beds, Mark Thompson lived a peaceful life. His home was nothing extravagant, a modest two-story house with white siding and a red front. But it was his sanctuary. What he loved most about the place was the backyard. It wasn't huge, but it was big enough for him to grow vegetables, set up a small shed, and even carve out a little corner for bird feeders. The space gave him a sense of freedom, something he cherished after long days at work. Mark had bought the house 5 years earlier, drawn not only by its affordability, but also by the promise of tranquility. He liked the idea of being surrounded by trees and open skies instead of city noise. For the first few years, everything went smoothly. His neighbors were friendly, if a little distant, and the Homeowners Association, HOA, rarely bothered him. They sent occasional newsletters reminding people to keep their lawns tidy or avoid parking boats in driveways, but nothing too intrusive. Life was simple, predictable, and pleasant. But then things changed. A new member joined the HOA board, a woman named Karen Wilson. At first glance, Karen seemed harmless enough. She was always dressed impeccably, her hair perfectly styled, and she greeted everyone with a smile that looked almost rehearsed. But it didn't take long for Mark, and many others, to realize there was more to Karen than met the eye. Within months of joining the board, she became its president, and that's when the real drama began. Karen had strong opinions about how the neighborhood should look and function. She believed every blade of grass should be cut to the same height, every mailbox painted the exact shade of beige specified in the HOA guidelines, and every homeowner should adhere strictly to her vision of perfection. To enforce these ideals, she started sending out letters filled with nitpicky complaints. One neighbor got reprimanded for leaving a garden gnome on their porch. Another received a warning because their curtains didn't match the approved color palette. It was exhausting, and soon, whispers of frustration spread through the community. Mark, however, tried to stay out of it. He figured as long as he kept his property clean and followed basic rules, he'd be fine. He mowed his lawn regularly, swept his driveway, and made sure his trash bins weren't left out overnight. Still, Karen found reasons to target him. First, she accused him of letting weeds grow along his fence line. They were actually wildflowers. Then she complained that his vegetable garden was unsightly and suggested he replace it with decorative shrubs. Each time, Mark politely explained his side, hoping to diffuse the situation without conflict. One sunny Saturday morning, while Mark was outside trimming his hedges, Karen appeared at the edge of his yard. She wore oversized sunglasses and carried a clipboard, which she waved dramatically as she approached him. "Mark," she said in a tone that sounded sweet, but carried an undertone of authority. "We need to talk." Mark paused, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Sure, Karen, what's up?" She pointed toward the back corner of his property, where his wooden fence met a cluster of tall oak trees. "That section right there," she said firmly. "It doesn't belong to you. According to the original subdivision maps, part of your backyard is technically common area owned by the HOA. Mark blinked, caught off guard. "What? That can't be right. I've owned this land for 5 years and no one's ever mentioned anything like that before." "Oh, it's true," Karen insisted, tapping her clipboard for emphasis. "The maps are very clear, and since it's HOA property, we'll need to discuss what happens next. Perhaps you could remove that shed. It's encroaching on our space." Mark felt a knot form in his stomach. He knew Karen well enough by now to suspect this might be another one of her schemes to assert control. But still, doubt crept in. Could she be telling the truth? Was it possible that part of his beloved backyard wasn't really his? Determined to get answers, Mark decided to dig deeper. He remembered seeing a copy of the property survey when he purchased the house, so he dug it out from his filing cabinet. The document confirmed what he already knew. The boundaries of his land extended all the way to the fence line. But Karen's claim nagged at him. If the survey was accurate, why would she make such a bold accusation? The next step was obvious. Hire a professional land surveyor. Mark called around and scheduled an appointment for someone to come out and verify the property lines. When the surveyor arrived, He spent hours measuring distances, examining markers, and comparing notes with the county records. Finally, he delivered his verdict. Mark's backyard was 100% within his legal ownership. There was no dispute. Karen's claim was baseless. Armed with this information, Mark felt confident enough to confront Karen again. He printed copies of the survey results and brought them to the next HOA meeting. When it was his turn to speak, he stood up and calmly presented the evidence. "As you can see," he said, addressing the room, "this proves my property extends to the fence line. There's no overlap with HOA land." Karen sat stiffly in her chair, her lips pressed into a thin line. For a moment she looked flustered, but then she recovered quickly. "These surveys are outdated," she snapped. "We have newer maps that show otherwise." Her response infuriated Mark. How could she dismiss hard facts so easily? And why was she so determined to claim land that clearly wasn't hers? As he left the meeting that night, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was going on here. This wasn't just about his backyard, it was about power. Karen thrived on controlling others, and she wouldn't stop until someone stood up to her. Little did Mark know this was only the beginning of a much larger battle. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that Karen's claim about his backyard wasn't just a random accusation. It felt calculated, like she was trying to flex her authority and push him into submission. But Mark wasn't the type to back down without a fight. He decided to do some digging of his own beyond the land surveyor's report. If Karen was so adamant about this supposed HOA-owned land, there had to be more to the story. The first step was visiting the local county clerk's office. Mark figured the original subdivision maps would be on file there, and he wanted to see them for himself. The clerk, an elderly man with thick glasses and a kind smile, helped him locate the records. Together they pored over dusty blueprints and faded documents. To Mark's relief, everything matched what the surveyor had told him. His property lines were clear and the backyard belonged entirely to him. There was no ambiguity in the official records, but as Mark flipped through the pages, something caught his eye. A handwritten note in the margins of one document mentioned a dispute from decades ago between the HOA and a previous homeowner. Apparently, the HOA had tried to claim part of that homeowner's land too, but the case was dropped after legal threats. Mark's heart raced. Was this a pattern? Had Karen pulled similar stunts with other residents? Determined to find out, Mark started talking to his neighbors. At first, he approached it casually, striking up conversations while walking his dog or chatting at the mailbox. "Hey, has Karen ever said anything weird about your property lines?" he'd ask nonchalantly. Most people shrugged it off, saying Karen focused more on cosmetic issues like paint colors or lawn ornaments. But a few neighbors hesitated, their expressions hinting at something deeper. One evening, Mark knocked on the door of Mrs. Peterson, an older woman who lived 2 houses down. She greeted him warmly, inviting him inside for tea. After some small talk, Mark broached the subject. "I've been dealing with Karen lately," he said carefully. "She's claiming part of my backyard belongs to the HOA. Have you ever heard of anything like that?" Mrs. Peterson sighed, setting her teacup down. "Oh, Mark, I'm not surprised. A couple of years ago, she accused me of building my garden shed on HOA land. I had to pay for a survey to prove her wrong. Thankfully, it turned out fine, but it cost me hundreds of dollars and weeks of stress." Mark leaned forward, intrigued. "Did she try to take it further? Like, threaten legal action or anything?" "Not with me," Mrs. Peterson admitted. "But I know another neighbor, a younger couple who sold their house shortly after Karen started hassling them about their driveway. They said it wasn't worth the hassle. I always wondered if she scared them into leaving." This revelation sent a chill down Mark's spine. If Karen had successfully pressured others into giving up parts of their property, or even selling their homes, it meant she wasn't just being petty. She was methodical, strategic, and relentless. And now, she had set her sights on him. Feeling both angry and motivated, Mark decided to dig even deeper. He reached out to former residents of the neighborhood, tracking them down through social media or mutual acquaintances. One man, Tom, agreed to meet him for coffee. Tom had lived in the subdivision 10 years earlier before moving to another state. Over lattes, he recounted his own nightmare with Karen. She came after me for my side yard, Tom explained, shaking his head. Said it was technically common area because of some old map. I hired a lawyer and eventually she backed off, but only after dragging it out for months. It was exhausting. Honestly, I think that's why we moved. I didn't want to deal with her anymore. Tom's story confirmed Mark's suspicions. Karen was using fear and intimidation to manipulate people. She preyed on those who didn't have the time, money, or energy to fight back. But Mark wasn't going to let her win. Not this time. Armed. With newfound knowledge, Mark began documenting everything. He kept copies of all correspondence with Karen, took photos of his property lines, and saved receipts from the surveyor. He also reached out to other current residents, encouraging them to share their experiences. Slowly but surely, a picture emerged of Karen's tactics. She targeted vulnerable homeowners, exploited outdated documents, and relied on the assumption that no one would challenge her. Despite the mounting evidence, Mark knew he needed to tread carefully. Confronting Karen directly wouldn't solve anything. It might even escalate the situation. Instead, he focused on building alliances within the community. Neighbors who had previously stayed silent began speaking up, sharing stories of how Karen's behavior had affected them. Some were hesitant at first, worried about retaliation, but Mark reassured them. "We're stronger together," he said. "If we stand united, she can't bully us anymore." As word spread, a sense of solidarity grew among the residents. For years, Karen's reign of terror had gone unchecked because people were afraid to rock the boat. But now, thanks to Mark's persistence, they realized they weren't alone. What started as a personal battle over a backyard was turning into something much bigger, a collective effort to hold Karen accountable. One afternoon, Mark received a message from Sarah, a young mother who lived across the street. "I found something interesting," she wrote. "Can you come over tonight?" Curious, Mark headed over after dinner. Sarah greeted him at the door, looking nervous but determined. She led him to her dining table, where a stack of papers lay spread out. "I was cleaning out my garage and found these old letters," she explained. "They're from when Karen first joined the HOA board. Look at this one. It's addressed to my husband." Mark picked up the letter and scanned it. In it, Karen demanded that Sarah's family remove a swing set from their backyard, claiming it violated aesthetic guidelines. But what really stood out was the tone, condescending, threatening, and eerily similar to the way she had spoken to Mark. The letter ended with a veiled warning. "Failure to comply may result in further action." Sarah nodded grimly. "We got rid of the swing set because we didn't want trouble. But reading this again makes me realize how ridiculous it was. She doesn't care about rules, she just wants control." Mark clenched his jaw. This was proof, not just of Karen's bullying tactics, but of her long history of abuse. With Sarah's permission, he took photos of the letters and added them to his growing collection of evidence. Piece by piece, he was assembling a case that would expose Karen for who she truly was. By the time he left Sarah's house that night, Mark felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just fighting for his backyard anymore. He was fighting for fairness, transparency, and the right of every homeowner to live without fear of harassment. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but Mark knew he wasn't alone. Together, he and his neighbors could bring an end to Karen's reign and reclaim their community. Karen wasn't the type of person to take setbacks lightly. When Mark stood his ground and presented undeniable proof that his backyard belonged entirely to him, she didn't back down. She doubled down. Her frustration boiled over into outright hostility, and her tactics became more aggressive. For Mark, it felt like a storm brewing on the horizon, one that threatened to sweep away the peace he had worked so hard to maintain. It started with anonymous letters. One morning, as Mark stepped out to grab the newspaper, he noticed an envelope tucked under his doormat. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the message inside was unmistakably aimed at him. "You're violating HOA guidelines," it read. "Your property is a disgrace to the neighborhood." There was no signature, but Mark didn't need one to know who was behind it. Karen's influence was everywhere, and this was just another attempt to rattle him. The letters kept coming, each one nastier than the last. Some accused him of neglecting his yard, others claimed his vegetable garden attracted pests and lowered property values. Mark tried not to let them get to him, but it was hard to ignore the growing pile of hate mail. What made it worse was knowing that Karen wasn't acting alone. She had convinced some neighbors to side with her, feeding them half-truths and exaggerations about Mark's supposed misdeeds. It was a classic divide-and-conquer strategy, designed to isolate him from the rest of the community. But Mark wasn't the only one feeling the heat. Other neighbors began reporting strange phone calls late at night. A woman named Lisa confided in Mark that someone had called her, urging her to file a complaint about his neglected yard. "They said you were setting a bad example for the neighborhood," Lisa told him, shaking her head. "I hung up, but I can't believe anyone would stoop that low." Even the local newspaper got involved. One day, while browsing the community section online, Mark stumbled upon a short article titled, "Resident Refuses to Comply with HOA Standards." The piece quoted Karen extensively, painting Mark as a troublemaker who refused to respect shared spaces. "We've tried reasoning with him," Karen was quoted as saying, "but he continues to disregard our rules. It's disappointing." Mark felt blindsided. He hadn't expected Karen to go public with her accusations, especially since she knew full well they weren't true. Still, the article stung. He imagined his neighbors reading it and wondering if maybe Karen had a point. After all, perception often mattered more than reality, and Karen was a master manipulator. Frustrated but determined not to let Karen win, Mark decided it was time to send a clear message. He needed to make it abundantly clear that he wasn't going anywhere, and neither was his backyard. Inspiration struck during a conversation with Tom, the former resident who had dealt with Karen years earlier. Tom mentioned how rural homesteaders sometimes used electric fences to protect their land from intruders. While Mark didn't expect anyone to trespass, the idea appealed to him. An electric fence wouldn't harm anyone. It was more symbolic than anything, but it would serve as a bold statement. This land is mine, and I'm willing to defend it. The next Saturday, Mark rented a truck and headed to a nearby hardware store. He spent hours selecting materials, consulting with staff, and learning how to install the fence safely. He chose a low-voltage system designed to deliver a harmless shock, a deterrent rather than a weapon. Once home, he got to work, hammering posts into the ground and stringing wires along his property line. By sundown, the fence was complete, surrounded by bright yellow warning signs that read, "Private property, electric fence active." Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. Neighbors peered over hedges and whispered on sidewalks, speculating about Mark's unusual move. Some thought it was brilliant, a clever way to stand up to Karen without resorting to violence. Others worried it might provoke her further, leading to even more drama. Either way, everyone agreed that Mark had made his point loud and clear. Karen herself showed up later that afternoon, predictably furious. She marched toward Mark's house, clipboard in hand, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. Her face was flushed red, and her sunglasses couldn't hide the fire in her eyes. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, pointing at the fence. Mark met her halfway, calm and composed. "It's an electric fence," he explained matter-of-factly. "It's entirely on my property, and it's meant to keep people from crossing onto land that doesn't belong to them." Karen sputtered, clearly caught off guard. "This is completely unacceptable," she snapped. "You're creating a hazard for the community. Children could get hurt." "That's why there are warning signs," Mark replied evenly. "Anyone who approaches the fence will see them. Besides, it's not meant to harm. It's just a reminder that this is private property." Karen glared at him, her lips pressed into a thin line. For a moment it seemed like she might lash out physically, but instead she turned on her heel and stormed off, muttering threats under her breath. "You'll regret this," she called over her shoulder. "The HOA board will hear about this." Mark watched her go, feeling a mix. One thing was certain: Karen wouldn't give up easily, but neither would Mark. The days following the installation of the electric fence were tense. Karen wasted no time escalating her campaign against Mark. She drafted formal complaints, circulated petitions demanding the fence's removal, and even organized emergency HOA meetings to discuss what she called a dangerous precedent. Her rhetoric grew increasingly dramatic, painting Mark as a rogue homeowner bent on disrupting the harmony of the neighborhood. Despite the pressure, Mark remained steadfast. He attended every meeting, armed with documents, photos, and witness statements proving that his actions were justified. He reminded the board, and anyone else who would listen, that the fence was legal, safe, and necessary given Karen's relentless harassment. Slowly but surely, cracks began to form in her narrative. Several neighbors spoke up in Mark's defense, sharing their own stories of Karen's bullying tactics. Even some members of the HOA board seemed skeptical of her claims, though they were careful not to openly challenge her. As the battle dragged on, Mark found himself reflecting on the broader implications of his fight. This wasn't just about a backyard or an electric fence. It was about standing up to injustice, no matter how small it seemed. Every time Karen tried to intimidate him, she reinforced his resolve to expose her behavior and protect his rights. And judging by the growing support from his neighbors, he wasn't the only one who felt that way. Still, Mark knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Karen was cornered, and desperate people often resorted to desperate measures. But Mark was ready. With the entire community watching, he prepared to face whatever came next, with courage, determination, and an unshakable belief in doing what was right. The morning after Mark installed the electric fence, the neighborhood buzzed with activity. People gathered in clusters on sidewalks and driveways, craning their necks to catch a glimpse of the yellow warning signs that now dotted Mark's property. Fine. Some whispered approvingly, impressed by his bold move, while others exchanged worried glances, wondering if this would only provoke Karen further. Either way, one thing was certain: the fence had become the talk of the town. Karen wasted no time responding. By mid-morning, she stormed into Mark's yard, her clipboard clutched tightly in one hand and her sunglasses perched precariously on her nose. Her face was flushed with anger and her voice carried across the street as she shouted, "Mark, what is the meaning of this absurdity?" Mark stepped out onto his porch, coffee mug in hand, unfazed by her dramatic entrance. He set the mug down on the railing and walked toward her, keeping his tone calm but firm. "Good morning, Karen," he said evenly. "I assume you're referring to the fence." "Of course I'm referring to the fence," she snapped, gesturing wildly at the posts and wires lining his backyard. "This is completely unacceptable. You've turned your property into some kind of fortress. Do you realize how dangerous this is? What if someone gets hurt?" Mark crossed his arms and met her gaze without flinching. "The fence isn't dangerous, Karen. It's low voltage, designed to deter, not harm, and there are warning signs all along the perimeter. Anyone who approaches will see them clearly." "That doesn't matter," Karen retorted, her voice rising even higher. "This isn't about safety, it's about principle. You're creating a hostile environment for the entire neighborhood. This is supposed to be a community, not some private compound." Mark raised an eyebrow, unimpressed by her theatrics. "A hostile environment? Really? Because I seem to recall you accusing me of violating HOA rules and claiming part of my land belongs to the association. Funny how none of that bothered you when you were the one making threats." Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Clearly, she hadn't expected him to call her out so directly. Recovering quickly, she adjusted her sunglasses and straightened her posture, attempting to regain control of the conversation. "That's beside the point," she said stiffly. "What matters is that your actions are disruptive and inappropriate. The HOA board will have something to say about this." "I'm sure they will," Mark replied coolly. "And when they do, I'll be happy to explain why the fence is entirely within my rights, and why it's necessary given the circumstances." Karen's jaw tightened, and for a moment, it looked like she might explode. Instead, she spun around and marched back to her car, muttering under her breath about consequences and due process. As her engine roared to life and she sped off down the street, Mark couldn't help but smile. For once, he felt like he'd truly gotten the upper hand. The ripple effect. Word of the confrontation spread quickly through the neighborhood. By lunchtime, nearly everyone knew about Karen's meltdown and Mark's steadfast response. Some residents applauded his decision to install the fence, seeing it as a clever way to stand up to Karen's bullying tactics. Others remained cautious, fearing that the situation might spiral out of control. But one thing was clear: the fence had shifted the dynamics of the neighborhood in ways no one could have anticipated. Lisa, the neighbor who had received the mysterious phone call urging her to file a complaint against Mark, decided to pay him a visit. She arrived carrying a plate of cookies, which she handed to him with an apologetic smile. "I just wanted to say, I think what you did was brave," she admitted. "Karen's been pushing everyone around for years, and nobody's ever stood up to her like this before." Mark accepted the cookies gratefully. "Thanks, Lisa, that means a lot, but honestly, I didn't do it to be brave. I did it because I'm tired of being pushed around. If we let her get away with this kind of behavior, she'll never stop." Lisa nodded thoughtfully. "You're right. Still, I hope this doesn't blow up into something bigger. She can be relentless." "It already has blown up," Mark said with a wry chuckle. "But if she thinks I'm backing down now, she's got another thing coming." Karen strikes back. True to form, Karen didn't waste any time escalating the situation. Within days, she filed a formal complaint with the HOA board, demanding that Mark remove the fence immediately. She cited vague sections of the HOA guidelines about maintaining aesthetic harmony and promoting community cohesion, though it was obvious to everyone that her real motivation was personal vendetta. The board scheduled an emergency meeting to address the issue, and attendance was unusually high. Neighbors packed into the community center, eager to hear both sides of the story. Karen arrived early, dressed in her signature power suit, looking every bit the aggrieved authority figure. Mark showed up shortly afterward, armed with folders full of evidence and a quiet confidence that made Karen visibly uneasy. When it was her turn to speak, Karen launched into a lengthy tirade, accusing Mark of everything from endangering children to ruining property values. She waved her arms dramatically, her voice dripping with indignation. "This so-called electric fence is nothing more than a slap in the face to our community," she declared. "It's selfish, reckless, and completely unnecessary." When it was Mark's turn, he took a deep breath and began speaking in a measured tone. He started by presenting the results of the professional survey, proving beyond doubt that the fence was entirely on his property. Then he shared copies of the anonymous letters, the newspaper article quoting Karen, and testimonies from neighbors who had experienced similar harassment. Finally, he explained the purpose of the fence: not to harm anyone, but to protect his land from unwarranted interference. "The truth is," Mark concluded, "this fence isn't about aesthetics or property values. It's about standing up to someone who has bullied and intimidated this community for far too long. I installed it because I refuse to live in fear of baseless accusations and threats. If removing it means giving in to those tactics, then I'm sorry, but I can't do that." The room fell silent as Mark finished speaking. Several neighbors nodded in agreement, while others exchanged murmurs of approval. Even some members of the HOA board seemed swayed by his argument, though they were careful not to show it openly. After hearing both sides, the board retreated to deliberate privately. When they returned, the chairman announced their decision. The fence could stay, for now. They ruled that it posed no immediate threat to the community and was located entirely on Mark's property. However, they added a caveat. If any future incidents arose involving the fence, they reserved the right to revisit the issue. Karen erupted in fury, slamming her fists on the table and accusing the board of bias. "This is outrageous," she shrieked. "You're letting him get away with blatant disregard for our rules." The chairman held up a hand, cutting her off. "Ms. Wilson, the board has made its decision. We suggest you respect it or find another avenue to address your concerns." Humiliated and defeated, Karen stormed out of the meeting, leaving behind a trail of muttered curses. Outside, reporters who had caught wind of the drama waited to snap photos and ask questions. Karen brushed past them, refusing to comment, while Mark lingered, briefly to thank his supporters. As he walked home that evening, Mark felt a mix of relief and determination. The battle wasn't over. Karen was still out there plotting her next move. But for the first time in weeks, he felt hopeful. The fence had done more than defend his backyard. It had sparked a movement. One by one, his neighbors were beginning to see Karen for who she really was, and they weren't afraid to say so anymore. Little did Mark know the real showdown was yet to come. The victory at the HOA meeting should have brought Mark a sense of peace, but instead, it only heightened his awareness that Karen wasn't the kind of person to accept defeat gracefully. If anything, her public humiliation at the hands of the board had ignited a fire within her, a dangerous mix of wounded pride and simmering rage. Mark knew she wouldn't let the matter rest. This was no longer just about a backyard or an electric fence. It had become personal. In the days following the meeting, tension in the neighborhood reached new levels. Neighbors whispered behind closed doors, speculating about what Karen might do next. Some feared retaliation, while others secretly hoped she would finally be forced to back down. But Mark didn't entertain either scenario for long. He stayed focused on protecting himself and his property, knowing full well that Karen's next move could come at any moment. The underhanded tactics begin. It started subtly at first. Anonymous letters reappeared in mailboxes. This time targeting not just Mark, but anyone who had spoken out in his defense during the HOA meeting. The notes accused these neighbors of siding with a troublemaker who was dragging down property values and ruining the community. One particularly nasty letter even suggested that supporting Mark made them complicit in creating a hostile environment. Mark noticed the change immediately. People who had been vocal supporters began avoiding eye contact when he passed by. Lisa, the neighbor who had brought him cookies after the confrontation with Karen, stopped answering his texts. When he finally caught up with her one evening, she admitted reluctantly, "I'm sorry, Mark, I don't want to get involved anymore. She's making life difficult for everyone." Mark understood her fear. Karen thrived on intimidation, and her tactics were designed to isolate her opponents. Still, it stung to see allies pulling away. It felt like the tide was turning against him, even though he had done nothing wrong. But Karen wasn't content with simply sowing discord. Her harassment escalated quickly. Late one night, as Mark sat in his living room reading, he heard a loud pop outside, followed by the unmistakable sound of air hissing from deflated tires. Cautiously stepping onto his porch, flashlight in hand, he discovered all 4 of his car tires slashed. Angry and frustrated, he called the police to file a report, though he doubted they'd find much evidence. Whoever had done it had timed their attack perfectly, under cover of darkness, leaving no trace. The vandalism didn't stop there. Over the next week, trash bags filled with rotting food appeared on his lawn overnight. Someone dumped buckets of dirt across his driveway, forcing him to spend hours cleaning it up. And then came the graffiti, crude words scrawled in red paint along the side of his garage. Each incident chipped away at his patience, but Mark refused to give in. Instead, he doubled down on his efforts to expose Karen's behavior. Building evidence. Determined to catch her in the act, Mark decided to install security cameras around his property. He positioned them strategically, facing his driveway, the street, and the edges of his yard near the electric fence. The equipment wasn't cheap, but it was worth every penny if it meant catching Karen red-handed. For weeks, he reviewed footage, obsessively, searching for any sign of suspicious activity. Finally, one chilly evening, the cameras captured something damning. As Mark scrolled through the recordings, he spotted Karen sneaking into his yard under the cover of darkness. She wore a hoodie pulled low over her face and carried a large garbage bag. Without hesitation, she dumped its contents onto his lawn before hurrying back to her car and speeding off. The video was grainy, but there was no mistaking her distinctive walk and the license plate of her vehicle. Mark stared at the screen, his heart pounding. He had proof now, undeniable, irrefutable proof, that Karen was behind the vandalism. For months, she had hidden behind accusations and veiled threats, pretending to be the victim while orchestrating chaos behind the scenes. Now, the truth was laid bare. Taking action. With the footage in hand, Mark went straight to the police station. He explained everything that had happened, the tire slashing, the trash dumping, the graffiti, and presented the video as evidence. At first, the officer seemed skeptical, likely assuming it was just another squabble between neighbors. But as Mark laid out the timeline of events and showed how each incident connected back to Karen, the officer's demeanor shifted. By the time Mark left the station, a formal investigation had been launched. News of the investigation spread quickly through the neighborhood. Neighbors who had distanced themselves from Mark began reaching out again, apologizing for doubting him and offering support. Even Lisa showed up at his door with another batch of cookies, this time accompanied by a heartfelt apology. "I'm so sorry I doubted you," she said. "You were right about her all along." Mark accepted her apology graciously, grateful for the renewed solidarity, but he also knew that things were far from over. While the police worked to build their case, Karen grew increasingly erratic. She started organizing petitions demanding Mark's removal from the HOA altogether, claiming he was disruptive and unfit to live in the community. When that failed to gain traction, she resorted to spreading rumors about him, accusing him of being unstable and dangerous. Despite the smear campaign, Mark remained calm and composed. He continued documenting every interaction with Karen, saving screenshots of her emails and recording voicemails where she lashed out at him. Slowly but surely, he built a comprehensive dossier detailing her pattern of harassment, not just against him, but against other residents as well. A turning point. So one afternoon, as Mark returned home from work, he found a sheriff's deputy waiting outside his house. His stomach dropped momentarily, fearing bad news, but the deputy quickly reassured him. "We've obtained a warrant for Karen Wilson's arrest," the officer announced. "Based on the evidence you provided, we believe she's guilty of criminal mischief and harassment." Mark exhaled sharply, relief washing over him. After months of enduring her bullying and manipulation, justice was finally within reach. The deputy explained that they planned to execute the warrant later that evening, ensuring Karen wouldn't have time to flee or destroy evidence. That night, as Mark watched from his window, he saw flashing lights pull up to Karen's house. Officers escorted her out in handcuffs, her face pale with shock and disbelief. Neighbors gathered cautiously on their porches, whispering among themselves as the scene unfolded. No one cheered openly. For many, it was still surreal to see someone who had wielded such power reduced to a suspect, but there was an undeniable sense of vindication in the air. As the dust settled, Mark took a moment to reflect on everything that had transpired. Installing the electric fence had been a bold move, but it had served its purpose. It drew a line in the sand and forced Karen to reveal her true colors. What surprised him most, however, was how the situation had galvanized the community. People who had once cowered under Karen's authority were now standing together, united by a shared desire for fairness and accountability. Still, Mark knew the fight wasn't entirely over. Arresting Karen was one thing, dismantling the culture of fear she had cultivated was another. Change wouldn't happen overnight, but he was hopeful. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt alive with possibility, a place where people could speak freely without fear of reprisal. As he stood on his porch that evening, watching the stars twinkle above the trees, Mark allowed himself a small smile. The road ahead would still have challenges, but he was ready. He had proven that even in the face of overwhelming odds, standing up for what's right could inspire others to do the same. And sometimes, all it took was one person, willing to take a stand to spark meaningful change.